On August 13, 1944, General George S. Patton stood inside his Third Army headquarters, staring at a map of northern France as if it were a door that had finally swung wide open. His troops had just taken Argentan, a small town roughly 15 miles south of Falaise, and the situation in front of him looked like the kind of perfect battlefield problem commanders spend their whole careers hoping to solve. More than 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in a tightening pocket, their backs pressed against an Allied noose that was finally drawing shut. Patton's armored spearheads were close, so close that, under normal conditions, they could reach the critical link-up area in hours and slam the escape route shut like a steel gate. He could almost feel the war ending faster if the trap closed now. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to General Omar Bradley, and the words that followed hit Patton harder than enemy artillery. "Stop where you are. Do not advance beyond Argentan." In that instant, victory didn't disappear. It simply froze, suspended a few miles away while the enemy ran for its life. Pasted Patton listened, as if he might have misheard, because the order sounded impossible. The German 7th Army was battered, broken, and retreating in chaos. The 5th Panzer Army was tangled up in the same shrinking knot of roads, hedgerows, and burning wreckage. One more shove, Patton believed, and the entire German force in Normandy could be crushed beyond recovery. He protested immediately, not with polite staff language, but with raw anger. He argued that the opening was right there, that the road ahead was lightly defended, that every hour mattered. He threw out a line that was pure Patton, sharp, aggressive, and deliberately insulting, saying that if he were allowed to go to Falaise, he could drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk. It wasn't a joke. It was a flare fired across the Allied command system. Bradley did not take the bait. He repeated the order. Argentan was the line. Third Army would halt. Third Army would wait. And so Patton put down the phone, looked back at the map, and saw the distance that mocked him. Roughly 15 miles between his forward elements and the forces closing in from the north. 15 miles that should have been nothing for armored units that had been racing for weeks. 15 miles that would stay open, partly open, shifting but alive, long enough for tens of thousands of Germans to pour through it. What followed wasn't merely a frustrating pause. It was, in Patton's eyes, a strategic failure with consequences that echoed through every bloody fight that came after, in every cold foxhole where Americans faced German veterans who should have been captured months earlier. The pocket itself had not appeared by chance. It grew out of German stubbornness, Allied pressure, and the slow, grinding violence that had defined Normandy since D-Day. For weeks after the landings, the Allied armies had been pinned inside the hedgerow maze, fighting yard by yard through terrain that made every field a miniature fortress. British and Canadian forces under Bernard Montgomery battled for Caen in brutal, costly steps. American forces under Bradley pushed through Bocage country with the same grim rhythm, each advance paid for in blood and time. German units held on until they were shattered, and even then they withdrew only when they had to. Then, on July 25, 1944, the pattern broke. Operation Cobra smashed through German lines near St. Lo, and the American breakthrough finally opened the kind of operational space armor needed. The First Army, driven by commanders who understood speed, punched a hole, and Patton's Third Army poured through like water, finding a crack in a dam. The sudden freedom of movement changed everything. Patton's columns surged across France, cutting roads, seizing towns, and turning German retreat into panic. And at that moment, when the Germans most needed discipline and clear-headed decisions, Adolf Hitler chose the worst possible course. Instead of ordering a withdrawal to a defensible line, he demanded a counterattack. On August 7, 1944, 4 panzer divisions lunged west toward Mortain, trying to cut off the American breakout and restore the front. The offensive failed catastrophically within roughly 48 hours, crushed by Allied firepower, air attacks, and the simple reality that the Germans no longer had the strength to reverse the tide. But that failed thrust created the very shape of the disaster to come. The Germans were left in a dangerous salient, Allied forces pressing from multiple directions. To the north, British and Canadian units pushed toward Falaise. To the south and east, American forces swung around to close the loop. The pocket began to form, and by August 12, 1944, more than 100,000 German troops, elements of the 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, were trapped inside a shrinking area between Falaise and Argentan. Their one real escape route lay through a narrow eastern gap toward the Seine. German commanders could see the truth clearly: escape now or be annihilated. Yet Hitler's orders insisted on holding positions and continuing to fight, even as the pocket tightened and roads became slaughter corridors. Every hour the opening stayed unsealed. More Germans slipped through. Every day of delay gave the survivors time to regroup, to salvage what they could, and to form new defensive lines farther east. The opportunity to destroy the German army in France was not merely a battlefield prize, it was a chance to reshape the rest of the war. Patton's Third Army had been operating only since August 1, 1944, yet it had already surged more than 200 miles. His troops liberated towns at a pace that stunned observers, and when Major General Wade Hyslop's 15th Corps took Argentan on August 13th, the resistance they met was surprisingly light. Reconnaissance reports suggested the road north was not heavily defended. Units were ready, armored formations poised to move, French armor eager to strike, American tankers impatient to roll. Patton saw the maneuver in his head as if it were already happening. 15th Corps drives north from Argentan, Montgomery's forces drive south from the Falaise area, and the jaws snap shut. A classic encirclement, the kind taught in staff colleges as theory, but rarely offered by history in such reachable form. The distance wasn't a campaign, it was a dash. But one line on an Allied map stood between Patton and that closing blow: the boundary separating Bradley's 12th Army Group from Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The line existed for practical reasons: preventing friendly fire, keeping command responsibilities clear, avoiding the chaos that can happen when armies collide on the same roads. Yet boundaries on paper do not stop enemies from escaping in real life, and Patton cared about one thing above all: destroying the German army while it was exposed. He demanded permission to push beyond Argentan, to accept risk, to coordinate on the move if necessary, because the battlefield was offering a once-in-a-war chance. Bradley faced a decision that looked tactical on the surface, but carried political weight underneath. If he allowed Patton to cross the boundary, he risked an incident. American and British units using different radio systems, different recognition signals, converging in confusing terrain. Friendly fire was not a fantasy. It was a real fear in coalition warfare. But the deeper issue was command friction. Montgomery was not Bradley's subordinate. He was a powerful ally with his own government behind him, and boundary agreements were intertwined with alliance politics. Changing them without consent could trigger protests that traveled upward: Montgomery to Churchill, Churchill to Roosevelt, turning a battlefield decision into a diplomatic crisis at the worst moment. Bradley had spent much of his career valuing method and coordination, and caution was woven into his instincts. Patton's request asked him to override those instincts, so Bradley chose the safest political path. Halt at Argentan, hold the line, and allow Montgomery's forces time to close the pocket from the north. It preserved alliance harmony. It reduced the chances of an accidental Allied-on-Allied disaster. It respected the negotiated boundary, but it left the gap breathing. Patton reacted exactly as Bradley expected and feared. He raged. He argued. He pointed out that German resistance ahead was thin, that the corridor was open, that delay meant escape. He warned that the opportunity would not return. Yet the answer did not change. Orders were orders. Patton passed the halt directive down the chain with barely controlled fury, and, along the roads south of Falaise, American tanks sat still, engines silent, crews climbing onto hulls, staring toward smoke and distant gunfire that marked the very escape route they were meant to close. They could hear the war happening in front of them and feel the absurdity of not moving. Meanwhile, Patton paced, map in hand, convinced they were watching the German army slip away for reasons that had nothing to do with battlefield reality. While Third Army waited, Montgomery's 21st Army Group was supposed to deliver the closing blow from the north. The 1st Canadian Army, supported by British formations, advanced toward the pocket's northern shoulder. These were battle-tested troops, hardened by weeks of fighting since D-Day. But the Germans defending the northern side were not passive victims. They fought with desperate skill, using the terrain to slow every advance. Hedgerows and embankments turned simple fields into defended lines. Anti-tank guns covered approaches. SS Panzer units executed fighting withdrawals, trading ground for time, contesting each position just long enough to keep the corridor alive. The tempo of the advance was methodical. Artillery preparation preceded assaults. Progress was careful, measured, controlled. Casualties were managed as much as possible. The result was that gains came slowly, sometimes in hundreds of meters rather than miles. By August 16, 1944, days after Patton's halt, Canadian forces still had not fully secured Falaise. The town finally fell on August 17th, yet even then the pocket was not sealed. The opening shifted eastward, narrowing in places, widening in others, but it remained usable. Allied units converged from different directions: British, Canadian, American, Polish, and coordination across national lines in that confused terrain was never simple. From August 13th through August 21st, 1944, the gap remained partly open. In that span, tens of thousands of German soldiers escaped. They did it in the ugliest way imaginable. Columns jammed the roads, vehicles packed tight, wounded men clinging to trucks, officers trying to impose order on a retreat that was turning into a stampede. Allied air power tore into anything that moved. Fighter bombers attacked the roads relentlessly, and wrecked vehicles created massive snarls that forced men to abandon equipment simply to keep running. In the August heat, the pocket became a landscape of burning fuel, black smoke, dead horses, shattered metal, and bodies. Pilots reported that the stench rose upward as they flew. On the ground, drivers were forced to steer around wreckage or over it, because stopping meant dying in the next strafing run. It was horror in motion, and still the Germans kept coming, because the alternative was surrender inside the pocket. German command changes only reinforced the urgency. On August 17th, Walter Model replaced Günther von Kluge and ordered every available unit to fight east toward the Seine. The instruction was simple: break out or vanish. Rear guards sacrificed themselves to hold back Allied pressure, while the main mass streamed through the corridor. Some formations withdrew with discipline. Others dissolved into chaos, but enough of them escaped to matter. Polish forces moving with the northern advance reached the Chambois area on August 19, 1944. American units from Patton's command linked with them around Saint-Lambert on the same date, tightening the noose at last. The trap closed fully only on August 21st, when organized German resistance inside the pocket finally collapsed. By then, the moment Patton had feared had already become reality. The pocket had inflicted enormous material destruction, but it had not captured everyone. Exactly how many Germans escaped has been argued for decades. War creates fog, paperwork disappears, units fragment, and the truth becomes a range rather than a clean number. Allied forces captured roughly 50,000 prisoners inside the pocket and counted around 10,000 German dead, with thousands of vehicles destroyed. Yet German records and post-war assessments suggest that somewhere between tens of thousands, perhaps as low as 20,000, perhaps closer to 50,000, slipped through. The number matters because of who they were. They were not simply stragglers. They included experienced veterans and remnants of elite armored formations, men who understood combined arms tactics, officers and non-commissioned leaders who could rebuild units, panzer crews who had learned to fight under Allied air dominance. Survivors from SS panzer divisions escaped. Elements of regular Wehrmacht divisions escaped. The escapees became the hardcore around which German defenses could be reconstructed farther east. That matters because the war did not end in August. Those survivors fell back toward the Seine, then toward fortified lines closer to Germany, forming the backbone of resistance that would make the autumn and winter campaigns so costly. Patton believed the failure to seal the gap changed the tempo of everything that followed. He believed it extended the war, perhaps by months, because the Allies missed the chance to remove experienced German formations from the battlefield before they could reform. The most dramatic proof of how survival in Normandy could become death in winter came on December 16, 1944, when Germany launched its last major offensive in the west through the Ardennes. More than 200,000 troops struck American positions that were thinly held and caught off guard. The spearheads included rebuilt panzer formations whose veteran corps had lived through the escape in Normandy months earlier. American losses in the Battle of the Bulge were staggering. Over 19,000 killed, with total casualties exceeding 80,000. It was the bloodiest battle the United States Army fought in the European theater, and the connection haunted commanders who understood the chain of cause and effect. Every German veteran who escaped the pocket was one more trained soldier who could fight again. During the Bulge, Patton's Third Army was ordered north to relieve the surrounded American forces at Bastogne. As he drove through winter roads and fought through determined German resistance, the bitterness returned because he recognized some of the formations opposing him. In his view, he was now paying in blood for decisions made in summer. It was not satisfaction. It was rage. The kind that comes when a prediction you never wanted proves true. Bradley later admitted, at least in reflective terms, that the halt at Argentan was probably a mistake. Publicly, he emphasized the risk of friendly fire and the complexity of coalition coordination. It sounded reasonable. Converging armies with different communications could shoot each other, and tragedy could have erupted in the confusion. Yet critics pointed out that coordination problems can be managed, that link-ups between Allied forces did occur without disaster, and that the deeper reason for the halt was not radios or recognition panels, but command politics. Bradley had chosen alliance harmony over operational boldness. He had avoided a clash with Montgomery over boundaries, avoiding a political storm, even if it meant letting the enemy slip the noose. Historians have argued about this decision for generations, because both sides can point to real risks and real costs. Defenders of the halt say friendly fire and control mattered, and that Montgomery's forces were already moving to close the pocket. Waiting a few days seemed rational at the time. Critics answer that the opportunity was too valuable to delay, that Patton was positioned perfectly, and that the enemy was already disintegrating. German commanders after the war often described the failure to close the gap as the most serious Allied mistake of the Normandy campaign, because it saved the German army in the West from complete destruction. Somewhere between those views sits the hard fact. The compromise satisfied neither pure military logic nor the ruthless demands of timing. The battles that followed in the fall of 1944 were grinding, costly, and often overshadowed by the drama of the Ardennes. Attacks against fortified German lines and brutal fighting in difficult terrain consumed tens of thousands of casualties for limited gains. Every additional week the war continued meant more telegrams sent home, more families shattered, more graves filled. Patton saw casualty lists as the real ledger of strategic decisions, and he believed that a choice made in August was being paid for in September, October, November, and December. By December of 1944, standing in the snow as his men fought toward Bastogne, Patton watched the consequences unfold in the bleakest form. This was the validation he did not want, the moment that proved his fear had been justified. He didn't need to announce it. His staff could read it on his face. The opportunity had been there, the gate had been open, and it had not been slammed shut. Now the cost was measured not in miles on a map, but in lives. And the question that refuses to die is the one that hangs over that phone call on August 13, 1944. If Patton had been allowed to drive from Argentan toward Falaise, could he have sealed the gap before the Germans escaped? Tactically, the answer is probably yes. An armored thrust across lightly defended ground could have closed the opening within a day or two. Strategically, the consequences might have been enormous. Fewer German veterans to rebuild shattered units, weaker defensive lines in the West, and perhaps a shorter road to Germany. But history did not take that path. Bradley made his choice. Patton obeyed. The gap stayed open long enough for thousands to run through it. And in the months that followed, Allied soldiers fought and died against an enemy that had been given the one gift it needed most: time. Hasted.